Roy Mackenzie had never imagined that his life after years of working on cruise ships would take the shape of a battle over bricks, stage lights, and an abandoned school building. Yet, in a way, it made sense, because all those years spent orchestrating grand light shows for tourists had taught him that every story needed a stage, and now he had found one that demanded to be brought back to life. The school had been empty for more than a decade, a squat red brick structure at the edge of clear pines, with tall windows covered in dust and ivy creeping up the corners, but the gymnasium with its faded wooden floor and cracked proscenium arch still held a kind of dignity, and Roy saw in it the possibility of turning emptiness into resonance, silence into voices, and neglect into purpose. He poured his savings into repairs, not the flashy kind of restoration that developers love to showcase, but slow and stubborn work, fixing leaking pipes with his own hands, sanding the warped floorboards until they could bear weight again, hanging second-hand curtains he had bargained for at an auction, and calling in favors from friends who owed him nothing except gratitude for the nights when he had once given them work. Soon the place began to change, not in a way that outsiders noticed, but in a way that the people who walked in could feel. Teenagers who had never been on stage suddenly found themselves speaking lines with trembling voices. Retired women who had spent years behind sewing machines stitched costumes with pride. A veteran with a stiff gait discovered he could direct movement by instinct, if not by practice, and Roy, for the first time in years, felt that he was not just entertaining, but creating. Something that had meaning beyond applause. The first public performance was nothing more than a reading of a community-written play about the town's own history. Yet the room was filled beyond capacity. Folding chairs squeezed between old bleachers, the smell of sawdust mixing with cheap coffee from a borrowed machine, and applause that echoed longer than the actors' voices. Word spread quickly that the abandoned school was alive again, not with gambling machines or storage boxes, but with rehearsals that went late into the night, and the building, once a hollow carcass, became a beacon for people who wanted to belong. Somewhere, Roy made no grand announcements, never hung banners or launched campaigns, because he believed that a place should prove its worth by existing rather than proclaiming it. But the quiet reputation of the theater grew, and it was enough for him to watch children who had once been shy speak with confidence, or to hear an elderly widower laugh as though he had rediscovered youth. For Roy, the theater was not a business, not an enterprise designed to profit, but a sanctuary disguised as a stage, and every evening when he locked the old heavy doors, he felt he was securing not only bricks and curtains but also the fragile faith of a community that had begun to trust him. What he did not realize was that beyond the narrow alleys and the modest applause, there were eyes measuring his success in different terms, eyes that saw property value rather than memory, opportunity rather than art, and control rather than culture, and while he was still swept in the simple joy of seeing his stage lights glow, another script was being written in the offices of the Homeowners Association, a script in which his theater would be cast not as a miracle of renewal, but as an intruder to be erased. Roy's first hint that something was wrong came in the form of a letter folded into an envelope with the embossed crest of Clear Pines Homeowners Association, delivered not by a city official or building inspector, but slipped through the iron gate of the old schoolyard as if it were a casual note left by a neighbor. He read it at his desk in the dim office that once had belonged to the school principal, the paper thick and expensive, the language cool and official. The facility was declared a misuse of residential zoning, the activities unauthorized, the gatherings unlicensed, and the building itself marked as unsafe for occupancy. The letter ended with a demand that operations cease immediately and that the property be vacated within 30 days. For a long moment, Roy simply stared at the words, unable to reconcile them with the permits and contracts he had signed at City Hall, the cheerful handshake from the councilman who had praised his initiative, or the small grant check deposited months earlier from a cultural development fund. He walked through the halls of the school, the smell of paint and sawdust still lingering, listening to the muffled laughter of volunteers rehearsing in the auditorium, and the absurdity of the letter struck him. How could this place, which had been dead for so long, now be condemned for being alive? Determined to resolve what he assumed was a clerical mistake, Roy went to the HOA office the next morning, carrying copies of his lease agreement and his occupancy permit in a thick folder. The office itself was housed in a modern low-rise building with glass walls that reflected the morning sun like a shield, and the receptionist received him with a polite but guarded expression. When he asked to speak to the president, he was told to wait, then led into a conference room where Kendra Sloan, a woman in her 50s with carefully styled hair and a posture sharpened by years of control, was already seated with a binder open. Before her, she did not greet him warmly, but instead slid across the table a duplicate of the letter he had received, as though the words themselves were more important than his presence. Roy laid out his documents, explaining in steady tones that the city had authorized his lease, that the fire department had inspected the building, that every step he had taken was legal. Kendra listened in silence, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were watching a performance that did not interest her, and then she said, "Mr. Mackenzie, this building may have been a school once, but under our revised residential covenant, any non-residential activity must be approved by this association, and you have not sought nor obtained such approval. You are trespassing on the rights of this community." The bluntness of her statement made Roy's stomach tighten. He repeated that the building was not within HOA jurisdiction, that the city itself had signed off, but Kendra only offered a smile that seemed less polite than triumphant. "You may think so," she said, "but the legal framework is more complex than you realize. We are prepared to pursue litigation if you do not comply." Her calmness was almost more alarming than if she had shouted. Roy left the office with the strange sensation that he had been dismissed from a stage where he was not allowed to speak. He returned to the school to reassure his volunteers, but a shadow had fallen over the project and whispers of doubt began to circulate. In the days that followed, subtle pressures mounted. A delivery truck with costumes was turned away at the neighborhood gate by a guard citing restricted access. A local supplier refused to extend credit for building materials, apologizing that they had been advised the property was under dispute. Then, one evening, the lights went out during rehearsal, plunging the auditorium into darkness, and when Roy went to check the breaker, he found that the main switch had been deliberately locked. The electric company told him the service had been suspended for non-compliance with regulations, though he had paid every bill on time. Each new obstacle carried the faint signature of coordination, as though unseen hands were pulling threads to unravel his work. Seeking clarity, Roy visited City Hall again, but there he encountered a colder silence. The clerk who had once greeted him warmly avoided his gaze, and when he asked for the file on his lease, she said it was unavailable pending review. In a side corridor, a junior employee he barely knew muttered, "You shouldn't have touched that building," before hurrying away, leaving him with a chill that no bureaucratic phrasing could explain. It became clear that this was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate effort to erase his project, to rewrite the narrative of the old school before it could fully take root in the community's memory. One night, unable to sleep, Roy walked the empty halls of the school, listening to the echo of his footsteps against plaster that still bore the faint marks of chalkboards removed long ago. He thought of the volunteers who had trusted him, the children who had found a voice on his stage, the veterans and widows and lonely retirees who had discovered companionship under the old rafters. The building had begun to heal people, and now someone wanted to close it down, not for safety or legality, but for a reason he could not yet see. He felt the walls themselves leaning in, as though the school were whispering that it had been saved from abandonment only to be condemned by greed. In that moment, Roy realized that he was not facing a dispute over zoning or paperwork, but something larger, a design hidden behind polite letters and carefully worded threats. And he understood, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that this was only the first act of a play he had never chosen to perform, a play in which the theater itself was both stage and prize, and he had just stepped into a battle scripted by others who had no interest in art, memory, or community. Roy tried to convince himself that the battle with the HOA would remain a paper conflict, a dispute of letters and counter-letters, but reality proved harsher. When he returned to the building after another frustrating morning at City Hall, he found 3 men in reflective vests carrying clipboards, walking through the hallways as if the school already belonged to them. They were contractors hired by the association, measuring windows and taking photographs of the walls, muttering about structural instability and fire code violations. Roy demanded to see their authorization, but they only shrugged and said they were acting under an order from Clear Pines HOA. When he called the police to report trespassing, the officer who arrived glanced briefly at the documents and then told Roy that this was a civil matter and outside their enforcement, a statement that left him stunned. The men continued their inspection as though he were invisible, writing notes that would soon reappear as the evidence against him. The next day, a formal notice arrived citing him for safety hazards and demanding immediate closure until renovations were approved by the association. The escalation did not stop with inspections. Volunteers who had faithfully come every evening began receiving letters at their homes, each stamped with the HOA crest, accusing them of participating in unlicensed gatherings and warning that they could be held personally liable for damages if. They continued to attend rehearsals. A widow named Margaret, who had sewn costumes with tireless devotion, broke down in tears as she showed Roy the letter, whispering that her late husband's pension could not withstand a lawsuit. Another volunteer, a retired bus driver, said he was threatened with fines for illegally parking near the school, though the curb had always been free to use. The message was clear. The association was not only targeting Roy but dismantling the community around him, splintering the fragile trust he had built. The most painful blow came when a group of parents, who had once begged him to let their children join the program, suddenly withdrew them, apologizing with downcast eyes. They explained that they had been told the theater was unsafe, that asbestos had been discovered in the walls, and that the city planned to condemn the building. Roy tried to reassure them, showing his inspection reports, but their fear outweighed his evidence. The laughter of children that had filled the corridors only weeks before was replaced by silence, the stage barren without their voices. It felt as though the building itself had reverted to its old abandonment, haunted not by emptiness, but by betrayal. Determined to fight back, Roy gathered every document he had and scheduled a meeting with an attorney recommended by a friend. The lawyer, a weary man with sharp eyes, studied the files for hours before saying, "You have every legal right to be here, but they're not interested in law. They're interested in exhausting you. They'll bury you in paperwork, drag you through hearings, and bleed you dry until you quit." He advised Roy to prepare for a long fight and to keep meticulous records of every interference. Roy agreed, though the thought of years in court made his stomach churn. He had not come to Clear Pines to wage war, but to build something fragile and hopeful. Yet now he found himself cast as an unwilling defendant in a game of attrition. The pressure grew stranger with each passing week. His mailbox filled with anonymous flyers warning residents that illicit activities were being held in the old school. On one occasion, a group of teenagers threw stones at the boarded windows, shouting, "Casino rat," before running off, and Roy realized the narrative was shifting in the public eye. His theater was no longer seen as a cultural project, but as something shady and untrustworthy. The cruel irony was that the lies spread faster than the truth, and the community that once applauded him now crossed the street when he passed. The final straw came one evening when he returned to find that the locks on the front doors had been changed again, but this time his own key no longer worked. Through the glass he saw a notice taped to the inside, stating that the building had been seized for safety violations, and that unauthorized entry would be prosecuted as criminal trespass. His own stage, His curtains, his lights, and the hundreds of hours of work poured into every nail and paint stroke were now on the other side of a locked door, guarded by language that made him feel like a criminal. He pounded on the door until his fists ached, the echo hollow in the empty street. But no one came. That night, sitting in his car in the deserted parking lot, Roy understood with a clarity sharper than pain that this was no longer about misunderstandings or misplaced authority. The HOA was dismantling his life piece by piece, and they had the confidence to act as if the law itself would bend in their favor. He realized that his only chance lay not in pleading, but in exposing whatever shadowed reason lay beneath their obsession with the building. And though exhaustion pressed down on him, though the silence of the abandoned theater felt like a verdict already passed, a spark of defiance ignited in his chest. He whispered to himself, as though rehearsing lines for a role he had never wanted, that this was not the end of the play, but only the turning point, and the real performance was yet to come. Roy's determination to unmask the motives behind the association's relentless campaign carried him back into the dusty archives of City Hall, where he spent entire afternoons bent over maps, deeds, zoning amendments, and minutes from council meetings that stretched back decades. He was exhausted from sleepless nights, living on vending machine coffee, but he forced himself to focus on the tangle of property records that seemed deliberately confusing, with pages missing, signatures blurred, and addendums stapled in haphazard order. It was during one of those long hours that he noticed a curious detail. The deed that defined the old school's status had been modified less than a year earlier, a modification not announced at any public meeting, but filed quietly in the back pages of the registry, where no one who wasn't looking for trouble would ever glance. According to this update, the school property was designated for temporary educational redevelopment, a phrase so vague that it could be interpreted in multiple ways. But what stood out was the name of the signatory, an attorney who also happened to serve as outside counsel for Clear Pines HOA. The realization made Roy's throat go dry. This wasn't coincidence or bureaucratic inertia. Someone had taken deliberate steps to rewrite the building's destiny long before he unlocked its doors. Unwilling to trust his own limited expertise, Roy carried the documents to a city planning consultant, a thin man named Foster who had spent his career tracing the hidden layers of land deals and zoning politics. Foster examined the papers in silence, tapping his pen against the table, then finally leaned back with a grim expression. "This is what we call a placeholder designation," he explained. "They use it to freeze an asset until they're ready to flip it. It looks harmless, but in practice it means your theater never existed on paper. They could shut you down, demolish the building, and claim they were always within their rights. And the fact that the HOA's lawyer signed it? That suggests collusion, not oversight." Roy felt the ground shift beneath him. For weeks he had been treated like an intruder, but in truth he had stumbled into the middle of a carefully engineered plan, one that predated his arrival. Foster gave him a warning as they parted. "Whatever you do, don't underestimate them. If they went to the trouble of rewriting records, it's because there's money at stake, and money never sleeps." That night, as he walked through the empty auditorium, Roy could not shake the feeling that the shadows along the stage curtains were no longer his allies. The silence was heavier than usual, as though the building itself understood that it had been written out of its own history. He thought of the children who had recited lines here, of the old veteran who had found meaning in directing, of Margaret's hands sewing until they bled, and he swore he would not let this place be erased by paperwork. The next morning he called Mia Garcia, a local investigative writer he had met at one of the first performances. She was younger than most of the volunteers, sharp-eyed, skeptical, and fueled by a restless energy that had often rubbed people the wrong way. When he told her about the altered deed and the lawyer's involvement, she agreed to meet him at the school without hesitation. Mia arrived with a camera not to film, but to photograph documents, insisting that evidence needed to be preserved before it vanished. Together they traced the trail of signatures, following corporate shells and obscure limited partnerships that led not to educational institutions, but to a private investment consortium operating under the name Clear Development Partners. When Mia cross-checked the address listed on one of the filings, she discovered that it matched a warehouse on the edge of town, a place rumored among locals to host private poker nights for wealthy insiders. Roy listened in silence as she explained her suspicion that the old school was only one piece in a larger pattern. Properties stripped of their public purpose, funneled through the HOA's influence, and converted into entertainment venues that operated just far enough outside the law to remain profitable. The revelation made sense of the rumors that had begun to circle in whispers, the unexplained trucks arriving at night, the flyers hinting at casinos. It was no accident that his theater had been targeted. It was occupying a space someone else had already marked for transformation. For days, Roy and Mia worked in secrecy, comparing notes, collecting copies of documents, interviewing former contractors who had been paid in cash to perform minor renovations on the school years earlier. One contractor, his voice low as though afraid of being overheard, admitted that he had once installed reinforced wiring in the basement, not for classrooms but for slot machines, though at the time he had assumed it was for an arcade. Another spoke of being told to seal off windows to create controlled light conditions, instructions that made no sense for an educational project but perfect sense for a casino floor. Each new detail added weight to their suspicion. The HOA had not only overstepped, but had actively conspired to convert community property into private profit, using zoning laws as camouflage. The breakthrough came when Mia unearthed correspondence between Kendra Sloan and a city council member, in which Kendra pressed for expedited approval of a community development project, without disclosing its true nature. The language was coded, full of euphemisms about youth engagement and after-school programs, but the attachments betrayed the truth. Architectural renderings of the school redesigned as a sleek casino hall, complete with neon signage and parking. Lots expanded for buses. Roy stared at the drawings in disbelief, unable to reconcile the place where children had once recited Shakespeare with the glossy monstrosity depicted on the plans. He realized with sickening clarity that he had not been fighting for his own dream alone. He had been standing in the way of a machine already set in motion, a machine that crushed obstacles without hesitation. Yet the discovery also gave him his first real weapon. With documents and testimonies, he and Mia could prove that the HOA had acted not as guardians of community standards, but as agents of private profit, manipulating laws for their own gain. It was a fragile hope, but for the first time Roy felt the balance tilt, however slightly, back toward truth. As he locked the doors that night, clutching the folder of evidence against his chest, he knew the path ahead would be perilous. But he also knew the play had reached its midpoint, that the curtain had risen on a new act, and though the antagonists were powerful and the stage hostile, the story was no longer about survival alone. It was about exposing corruption hidden beneath. The polished smiles of those who claimed to defend the community. He whispered into the darkness of the auditorium, "They turned a school into a casino. Let's see how they explain that to a judge." And for the first time in months, the silence seemed to answer with something other than despair. The days that followed their discovery became a blur of mounting tension, because once Roy and Mia realized what the HOA had planned, every step they took to secure evidence seemed to trigger another wave of retaliation, as if unseen eyes were monitoring their progress and tightening the screws each time they moved forward. It started with letters, this time not addressed to Roy but to the volunteers who still clung to the project, formal warnings that their continued involvement in unauthorized activities could expose them to civil penalties. Margaret, the seamstress, received a letter threatening that her modest house, the one she and her late husband had lived in for 40 years, would be subject to a property lien if she persisted in assisting Roy, and the effect was devastating. She stopped coming overnight, leaving half-finished costumes draped across her sewing table like abandoned dreams. A retired bus driver named Thomas, who had always provided rides for children to rehearsals, found a bright orange notice taped to his door accusing him of violating HOA parking ordinances, and when he ignored it, his car was towed without explanation. The message was unmistakable. The association had shifted from intimidation of Roy himself to a campaign of fear aimed at dismantling his support system. But what unnerved Roy most was the sudden presence of unfamiliar vehicles parked near the school at odd hours, black SUVs with tinted windows that remained motionless for long stretches as if waiting for someone to slip up. He tried to dismiss them as coincidence until one evening he returned from a meeting with Mia to find the main entrance door ajar, though he had locked it earlier that day. Inside, nothing was stolen, but his desk drawers had been rifled through, papers scattered, and the folder containing the copied deeds and renderings was missing. He had made duplicates with Mia, but the violation left him shaken. A warning written in silence. "We know what you have, and we can reach you whenever we choose." Mia, unshaken in her outward demeanor though her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, insisted they push harder. She arranged to meet a former contractor who claimed to have been paid in cash by a shell company connected to the HOA to install ventilation systems in the old school basement. The man arrived jittery, looking over his shoulder, and spoke in hurried tones about reinforced air ducts and specialized wiring, details that confirmed the space was intended not for classrooms but for a facility requiring heavy cooling and discreet power management. He refused to sign a statement, muttering that people who asked too many questions about Clear Pines ended up moving away suddenly, but the fear in his voice was evidence in itself. At the same time, new filings appeared at City Hall that moved with suspicious speed. Petitions signed by HOA members demanding rezoning of the school property to community recreation, a category broad enough to include private clubs but narrow enough to exclude Roy's theater. The petitions contained dozens of signatures, yet when Mia cross-checked them, several belonged to residents who had moved years earlier, or, in one grim case, had died. The forgery was obvious, but its brazenness revealed how confident the HOA felt in its grip on the process, as though legality was a costume they could sew to fit any occasion. One evening, as Roy and Mia left a diner where they had been comparing notes, a man approached them in the parking lot. He was tall, dressed too neatly for a casual encounter, and his smile never reached his eyes. He addressed Roy by name and said, almost kindly, that people with talent should know when to exit the stage before the play turns ugly. Then he walked away without another word, leaving behind the cold certainty that this was no longer a matter of lawsuits and property lines, but of pressure that could turn physical. Roy tried to mask his unease, but the warning echoed through his mind as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that Mia's safety was now entwined with his fight. Despite the threats, they pressed on, compiling a growing archive of documents and testimonies, and finally decided to file a formal complaint in court. Roy's lawyer, skeptical but intrigued by the depth of evidence, agreed to present it, and the case was scheduled for hearing. In the weeks before the court date, harassment intensified. Volunteers received prank calls at night, electrical service to the building flickered on and off without reason, and Roy discovered fresh graffiti across the theater doors reading, "Close." The curtain. These acts lacked the polished veneer of legal intimidation. They were raw gestures of hostility, meant to sap resolve through humiliation and fear. Through it all, Roy found himself wavering between exhaustion and fury, because each attack reminded him that the school was not just a building, but a symbol of how fragile community could be when power decided to rewrite reality. He realized that the HOA was no longer trying to win through procedure alone, but to break his will before the trial began. Yet their desperation also revealed cracks in their armor, because only those who fear the truth resort to such crude tactics. Standing in the empty auditorium late one night, Surrounded by dismantled props and silent rows of seats, Roy promised the building itself that he would not abandon it. Whatever lay ahead, he would walk into that courtroom carrying not only papers and evidence but the weight of every voice that had spoken on his stage. And as he whispered those words into the darkness, he thought he heard the faintest echo in return, as if the walls themselves urged him forward. The courthouse on the morning of the hearing felt less like a place of law than a stage where every player had rehearsed their lines, and Roy entered with the uneasy awareness that he was both defendant and accuser in a drama larger than himself. The room was crowded with residents, some curious, some hostile, many whispering as though gossip had already decided the outcome. Kendra Sloan sat at the table opposite him, her tailored suit immaculate, her expression carved in the serenity of someone who expected to win by default. Her attorneys, a trio of men with polished shoes and the hollow confidence of endless billable hours, stacked binders in front of them as though the weight of paper alone could crush opposition. Roy's own lawyer spoke in low tones, reminding him to stay calm, to trust that truth mattered, but Roy knew that in rooms like this, truth often wore disguises. The proceedings began with the HOA presenting its case, a litany of accusations that painted the theater as a dangerous, unlicensed nuisance. They cited safety hazards, zoning violations, unauthorized gatherings, and unpaid fees, each charge delivered in precise monotone, accompanied by documents stamped with official-looking seals. The evidence was elaborate but brittle, for as each photograph and report was displayed, Roy recognized distortions. A picture of his stage taken when the lights had been deliberately cut, a fire code violation report signed by an inspector who longer worked for the city, lists of supposed complaints from residents who had never once set foot in the building. The performance was polished, but Roy could see the threads unraveling beneath the surface, and when it was his turn, he stood not as an actor, but as a witness to the theft of reality. His lawyer introduced the folder of documents he and Mia had gathered, laying out the timeline of altered deeds, shell companies, and architectural renderings that revealed the school's intended transformation into a casino. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the drawings were projected onto the screen. The familiar outline of the old school reimagined as a neon-lit gambling hall. Roy described the intimidation, the forged petitions, the harassment of volunteers, his voice steady but carrying the quiet rage of a man who had watched community turned into currency. Then Mia was called, and though the attorneys for the HOA tried to dismiss her as a meddling writer, her testimony carried weight. She spoke with calm precision, citing dates, names, and contradictions in the HOA's filings, her evidence corroborated by copies of emails and signatures that contradicted the association's story. The turning point came when Roy's lawyer summoned a reluctant witness, the contractor who had installed the reinforced wiring in the basement. At first he wavered, glancing nervously at the room, but under oath his voice steadied, and he admitted that the job had been arranged not by the city, but by a company tied directly to Kendra's husband. Gasps punctuated his words, and even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The HOA attorneys scrambled to object, but the damage was done, because the testimony connected every thread. The altered deed, the shell corporation, the fabricated safety reports, all converging on a single scheme to seize the school and convert it into a private casino under the guise of community development. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell into a silence heavier than stone. He declared that the HOA had exceeded its authority, that the evidence of forgery and collusion was undeniable, and that the attempts to close the theater were not acts of governance, but of corruption. He ordered the restoration of Roy's lease, the suspension of the HOA's jurisdiction over the property, and referred the matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation. For a heartbeat, Roy could not breathe, because the words were more than a legal ruling. They were a vindication that the voices silenced in his theater had been heard at last. He turned to Mia, who allowed herself the briefest smile, and for the first time in months the weight on his chest lifted, replaced by the raw, trembling relief of victory. In the weeks after the verdict, the old school no longer felt like contested ground, but like a place awakening from a long siege. Its corridors filled again with the scrape of chairs being arranged, the murmur of rehearsals, and the laughter of volunteers who returned cautiously at first, and then with growing confidence once they saw the locks replaced and the doors open without fear of sudden closure. Roy moved through the building with a sense of reverence, touching the scarred wood of the stage and the patched plaster walls as though to reassure himself that they were real, that the building had survived not only time, but the deliberate attempt to erase it. The community followed, some ashamed of their silence, others emboldened by the revelation of corruption, and gradually the theater became not only a cultural project, but a symbol of resistance, proof that small voices could withstand the machinery of greed. Kendra Sloan resigned from the HOA within days, though she gave interviews claiming she had been misunderstood, that her intentions were noble, that she had always acted for the community's benefit. Few believed her, especially after the district attorney announced an inquiry into the financial ties between her husband's companies and the association's projects. The grand plans for the casino vanished into rumor. The warehouse on the edge of town stood empty, and the shadow of intimidation that had hung over residents began to dissolve, though the memory of it lingered like a scar. For Roy, the victory was not triumphal but sobering, because he understood how fragile justice could be, how easily documents and signatures could bend truth, and how close he had come to losing everything. Yet, when the first performance after reopening filled the auditorium with people standing shoulder to shoulder, applauding not out of courtesy but out of gratitude, he felt the meaning of survival sharpen into joy. On stage, children recited lines with trembling voices. Elders sat with tears in their eyes, and the theater breathed as if the building itself had been restored to life. Roy watched from the back row, overwhelmed by the realization that he had not merely defended a dream, but had given the community proof that it was possible to push back. And in that moment, he understood that the story was no longer about him alone, but about everyone who had chosen to stand beside him when the lights threatened to go out.